I'm Travis. Thanks for joining us again on All Clear. Today we have another great guest with us. We have Peter Weyhreter. Did I get it right?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Peter Weyhreter, who is a VP with Gamma Electronics. And we have a kind of an unusual topic today. And I'm going to let, first of all, Peter introduce himself and tell us what he's an expert at.
Hi, it's Peter. I'm with Gamma. I'm the VP of Gamma. I've been with the company for 18 years now. I'm one of the earliest employees of Gamma Electronics, and I have an absolute passion for helping first responders stay safe and stay communicating. First of all, that's my passion. That's what I love to do. That's what I enjoy. And just about everything we do at Gamma helps first responders stay safe through the communication of their backbones and the systems that are inside their in-building communication system. So that's like, in a nutshell, that's our mission, that's our passion. There's a lot more to it, but that's what I love, and that's the crux of, I think, where Travis wanted to go today in this awesome conversation.
Absolutely. I'm going to throw out a couple of the fire service is famous for using all types of letters to describe stuff. Firefighters may have heard the term BDA. They may have heard the term ERCS. I think that's the other one, Emergency Responder Radio Communications. There are all types of letters that describe basically what is a repeater system inside of buildings to help firefighters and EMS and police, first responders, to be able to communicate. And Peter, it's important. I can't say enough. It would be very easy to underestimate the value of good radio communications. It's one thing when you can talk to your guys that are right there next to you, but when you need to talk to somebody that's out of range or you can't hear, radio communication is crucial. And the fire code called out for these emergency responder radio systems several years ago. And for here in our municipality, for example, they're relatively new. It's not something that we've dealt with a whole lot until very recently. Now we have big warehouses and large industrial complexes that have to have them. And I know that you are quite well versed in the BDA systems. That's what I'm going to call them today, if that's okay. And maybe you can help us understand their importance and also how they work, because I can definitely speak to the fact that they are very necessary, but sometimes our firefighters don't even know they're in buildings. So what type of information can you give them to maybe help them identify a building that may have a BDA system in it?
So I think, Travis, a good place to start on this would be exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about a BDA, if that's all right. So when we refer to BDAs, I think all first responders, when they communicate, they know they use a radio, right? And they're trained on how to use the radio. They push buttons to talk, and there's communication that goes back and forth between A and B. Now, in their mind, this system should be working all the time. But we all know first responders, first of all, when they are at work, they're not in their fire stations where they can communicate. They're actually out in the field. And when they're out in the field, a lot of the times they're inside buildings. So what the BDA does, or a bidirectional amplifier, is exactly that. It's an amplifier that grabs signal, amplifies it, and spreads it throughout the building. So when there's a BDA, there's also antennas, a lot of antennas involved. And these antennas are used where they grab signal from outside the building, they funnel it inside the building into an amplifier, which is called the BDA. There's also battery backup units. There's different brands of BDAs that do different things, that work on different frequencies. And the BDA matches the same frequency that the two-way radios are used from the first responders, from your EMS, from your fire, and from your law enforcement, right? And it's really important to understand that these BDAs, or these amplifiers, are critical backbones for communication inside a building. And the primary reason why is because in nature, building materials, if I can help you understand, your listeners, when they walk into a building, they've ever gone down into a basement, for example, or they've gone into a subterranean parking lot, all of a sudden they're on their cell phone and they can't communicate anymore. They can't make a call out. They can't call their friend, and they had no signal. This is the same types of signals are what two-way radios are used. They're usually just different frequencies. And so because of that, the same materials that block cell signals are the same materials that block bidirectional amplifiers. being a critical communication part of it, of your first responders to be able to communicate inside, these systems are necessary in order for them to communicate inside buildings, because all these building materials like steel, concrete, low E glass is a new product. So the more environmental friendly that these buildings get, then the more signal that they block.
A- And that's one of the things that I think a lot of us don't think about. We know that concrete, we know that steel, we know when you go down in the basement, it's like a bunker. You're not going to be able to get out a lot of times with your radio. But you hit a very critical one, that low E glass. I did not realize how big of a blocker that actually is for radio signal. But I was over at Honeywell at I guess at their world headquarters here in Charlotte for a class on BDAs one time. And when we were watching our radios, and when we got close to the glass of the building, you could see our signal just almost nosedive. And you would think getting close to a window would be better for you, but that is a good point, that even glass can be prohibitive to your radio signal sometimes.
Yeah, and I think, and it can be a real point of frustration, in my opinion, because you think, from a first responder's point of view, when you show up to a location and you need to talk to your team, and then it's working, then it's not. And then all of a sudden, in certain parts of the building, it's working, and then it doesn't. And in those instances, more than likely, either the public safety DAS system, the BDA is also what we can call it, either isn't working or was never installed. And that's where some of those challenges come in. There's a lot of reasons why it may not be there. The building may have been built before code required them to put them in. The authority having jurisdiction may have not even required them to put one in and may have given them a pass, or the system hasn't been monitored properly and should be on a yearly basis, and it may not be working. And in my opinion, that puts team members, first responders, in a real pickle and a real pinch, because they may think that they can communicate and then they don't, and then something happens, and that's even worse.
It's interesting. A lot of firefighters, in fact, they may be trying to turn off the podcast right now when I mention the word fire code. A lot of times the fire code isn't just for public safety, but it's also for the safety of us that are in the industry. And a lot of times firefighters may not know that there is a BDA in the building. And one of the things that is truly important, and I hope all of our listeners take note of this, when you go out and you do your pre-plans, you go out, you look at a building, you walk through, you figure out where the gas shutoff is, you figure out where the electrical room is, where the sprinkler riser is. At the same time, you need to be looking around for telltale signs of the fact that there's a radio repeater in the building. And it's important for you to understand that. Now, Peter, what are some indicators that there may actually be a BDA system in a building? If you just walk in the door, what would be an indicator that there might actually be one in the building?
If you just walk in the door, depending on where you are, for example, New York City, they actually have ARC systems. When you first walk in, you may not be able to tell that there's a BDA system installed in this building. There would have to be probably a radio room or a dedicated room for the bidirectional amplifier. And they have big red boxes that usually will have a brand name on it, multiple different brands. And that big red box has a bunch of antennas coming out of it. And those big red boxes will be the key telltale sign of whether or not it has a system. From the outside looking in, you would never know that a system is there. And maybe that's something that can be changed within jurisdictions, that they could put signs up on buildings to say that these have active BDAs in them. I don't know of any signs that are put up in buildings off the top of my head. So if you're a first responder, you really wouldn't have any. And that might be something we could talk about. You may have no idea whether or not there's a working BDA installed in that building to give the first responders confidence knowing that when they go in, they could talk, because the old buildings definitely don't have them. So the new buildings likely would, hope they would, right? So that's the only real way to know. To the trained eye, you're not going to look up and be able to know that, oh, this has an antenna in this hallway, and this is an antenna that's got, cabling behind it that runs back to the backbone or back to the BDA. You would never know.
Well, I know in our jurisdiction here, one of the things that you will find very frequently, particularly in our newer buildings that do have those types of systems in them, when you go into wherever the fire alarm panel is or the annunciator panel, even if you don't see the head unit or that big red box for the BDA, the first indicator is going to be the fact that frequently there's a small panel to the right that has like little LEDs, and it'll say things like antenna failure. It'll say power failure, battery failure, things like that. If you see one of those, there's a good chance that there is a radio relay system in that building. And if there is, you should ask a few more questions like, hey, where is this at? Now, one thing that here in our jurisdiction in Concord that we do require is that rooms that have BDAs in them actually have the lettering on the door, just like you would a fire alarm control panel or a sprinkler riser room. We try to make sure that it's indicated when you walk through the building. So we try to make it a little bit easier. We don't put it on the outside of the building, obviously. But the biggest thing that I can say from the industry side is you need to walk around when you do your pre-plan. You need to ask, hey, do you guys have a radio repeater system in this building? I cannot speak enough to the fact of how valuable that is. But Peter, did you know?
So,
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
oh no, so Travis, that's interesting. So, because that's what I thought you were talking about. I thought you were talking about initially when you walk in, but as far as there's no indicator, like when you would walk in, they wouldn't be able to tell, would they?
Nope, not unless you ask.
You'd have to ask, or you'd have to go to the radio closet and find the annunciator / BDA yourself. Okay, all right. That's fine, because I was like, wow. Now, if they did, maybe it would be helpful. I don't know.
Well,
Maybe it would be helpful if they did. If there was a small little, this building has got a BDA inside, and maybe that would be helpful for first responders.
yep, that's why it's important for us to get out in our districts, go walk through buildings. If there's new buildings, in fact, right now, whenever I'm COing a new building or going through and doing the final inspections, I always encourage the companies, hey, come walk through, look, see what's going in here. That way they can become familiar with it when there are things like the BDA systems that are in there. But now, Peter, I got a question for you. Let's say you have an older building and it does not have a BDA in it. Did you know that firefighters typically plan for a radio failure? Did you know that?
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. And
So how do they plan for that? I'm curious.
well, this goes back to that thing when you walk through the building, all of a sudden your radio dies. There are ways that you can make it work. And I'm a ham radio nerd from a long way back. So I know that certain signals don't pass through certain walls, and you probably know that too, Peter. But what happens when you get 2 points that are closer together? It's easier for them to communicate to each other. So a lot of times what guys will do, they will actually set the radio up to go point to point. So more or less it's like playing a game of telephone where you'll have one person that's in the area that's more or less dead to what goes out. Then he'll be communicating to another guy that might be at the door. And then he'll be communicating to one that's maybe standing outside of the building. So basically they're setting up a chain of communication that goes all the way through. That is one of the things they do. And it's important that we always have that in our back pocket. We always want to use the BDA as our first option because it is the most reliable, but there are ways that we can work around it when we have to. And that's why it's important that when we go in and we train, we need to train with our gear on and we need to train with our radios, because that is just as important many times as an axe, a Halligan, even your hose. That's how important that radio is when you have a problem.
Yeah, I can't believe it without any other way. That's interesting. I'm not a two-way radio guy. I'm more on the back end side. So I guess that would matter maybe you can help me understand, matter on the type of radio system that you have to be able to do sort of a point-to-point interaction with each other. And then when you do that, do you not have to communicate from, let's just say you've got a guy at A, B, C, and then someone at the truck. They can't talk directly to the guy at the truck, right? So do they have to play a game of telephone then? Is that what it's like?
Pretty much. And then sometimes you'll see a guy that'll have two radios, one that he's communicating to the dispatch and then one he's communicating back into the building with. So it gets really complicated when these systems aren't in place. But one of the limitations that I know that a lot of particularly smaller departments face, and and I'm sure you've dealt with this, departments that maybe have antiquated radio equipment that they carry. Maybe their handhelds aren't of even a digital space at this point. And when you see that older equipment, you have to start asking, does this jurisdiction do BDAs? Are they even familiar with what they are? So that's one of the things that it's important for firefighters to do. As we mentioned, get out in your district, learn your buildings, learn about these BDA systems. But more importantly, if you're, say, a paid firefighter at a certain department, if you go to your rural department, maybe you're at a volunteer department, take that knowledge with you and share that with the guys, because they're less and less common when you get into rural areas. It's more of a thing you see where, like, for example, here in Concord, North Carolina, where we are, we're starting to have taller and taller buildings. We're having bigger and bigger warehouses and bigger industrial complexes. And we're starting to get to the point where some of the buildings are actually starting to block each other and getting close. So signal in some areas is really pinched out. And it's important when you start getting out in areas that are more spread out, you could be having a